Welcome to Billionaire Romance audiobooks. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. These are stories about love, loss, and the moments that change everything. Now, let's begin. Charles Johnson guided his midnight gray Bentley through the slow-moving traffic of downtown, one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel, the other tapping absently against a polished wood trim. The city glowed around them, glass towers reflecting the late afternoon sun, pedestrians weaving between crosswalks with the unhurried confidence of people heading home. Beside him, his wife adjusted the hem of her tailored coat, checking her reflection in the side mirror. Everything about her was composed, intentional. She fit effortlessly into the world Charles had built. "Dinner reservations are still confirmed, right?" she asked lightly. "I don't want to be late. The chef hates last-minute changes." "They're confirmed," Charles replied, his voice calm, practiced. "They always are." At 42, Charles had learned how to make certainty a lifestyle. His success hadn't come from luck or passion, but from precision. From knowing exactly what he wanted, and just as importantly, what he didn't. Complications had a cost. Emotions were unpredictable. People wanted things that couldn't be scheduled, negotiated, or postponed. Years ago, he had decided he preferred simplicity, stability, a life that ran smoothly, without sudden demands pulling him in directions he hadn't planned for. His marriage reflected that philosophy perfectly. They worked well together. They entertained the right people, attended the right events, lived in the right neighborhoods. There were no dramatic arguments, no messy expectations. Everything was balanced, manageable, safe. The traffic light ahead turned red, and Charles eased the car to a stop. The hum of the engine softened, replaced by the distant sounds of the city, snatches of conversation, footsteps on concrete, a siren wailing far away. He exhaled slowly, unaware that this pause, this ordinary, forgettable moment, was about to fracture his life. The crosswalk filled with people. Office workers with loosened ties. Couples walking too close together. A woman laughing into her phone. Charles's gaze drifted across them without focus, his thoughts already moving ahead to the evening. Wine selections, polite conversation. Another night that would end exactly as expected. Then something made him look again. She was moving more carefully than the others, navigating the crosswalk with deliberate precision. At first, all he noticed was the way she held herself, the familiar curve of her shoulders, the instinctive tilt of her head as she adjusted her grip. His chest tightened. No, it couldn't be. She stepped fully into view, and the world seemed to narrow around her. Lisa James. The woman he had not seen in over a year. The woman he had walked away from when she wanted more than he was willing to give. She was pushing a wide stroller, her attention focused downward, murmuring softly as she adjusted a blanket. Then she shifted her hands, and Charles saw them. Three tiny faces nestled together, bundled in soft fabric. Triplets. Time slowed in a way Charles had never experienced. The noise of the city dulled, replaced by the pounding of his own heartbeat. His mind rejected the image even as his eyes traced every detail, the careful way Lisa moved, the ease in her posture, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. A mother. The light was still red, but the moment felt unbearable. Lisa didn't look toward him. She didn't hesitate. She crossed the street and disappeared into the crowd on the other side, leaving behind a silence that felt too large for the space it occupied. The light turned green. Cars behind him began to move. Charles pressed the accelerator, his hands no longer steady. And for the first time in years, the life he had built no longer felt secure. It felt fragile and terrifyingly incomplete. Chapter 2. The question he couldn't ask. Charles drove in silence. Beside him, his wife scrolled through her phone, occasionally reading aloud from a message or commenting on someone's social media post. Her voice was pleasant, distant, background noise to a conversation Charles wasn't having. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with more force than necessary. The city moved past them in familiar patterns, storefronts he'd seen 1,000 times, intersections he could navigate without thinking. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But something had shifted. Triplets. The word circled through his mind like a diagnosis he didn't want to accept. He tried to calculate backward, to pinpoint when it might have happened, but the timeline felt impossible to construct while maintaining the carefully controlled expression on his face. "You're quiet," his wife observed, not looking up from her screen. "Long day." "Just thinking about the quarterly reports," Charles said smoothly. The lie came easily. "It always did," she nodded, already moving on to the next notification. Charles took a deliberate breath, forcing his shoulders to relax. This was absurd. Lisa could have met someone immediately after they ended things. She could have been seeing someone before they ended things. The triplets could belong to anyone. Could. The word itself was the problem. It left room for possibility, and possibility was not something Charles had designed his life to accommodate. He had ended things with Lisa for precisely this reason, because she had wanted conversations about the future that felt too open-ended, too demanding. She had looked at him with expectations he couldn't meet, asked questions he couldn't answer. She had wanted certainty about things that couldn't be guaranteed. So he had chosen certainty in a different form. He had chosen someone who didn't ask those questions. The traffic thickened as they approached their neighborhood. Charles slowed, his mind still racing even as his hands performed the familiar motions of driving. 3 babies. He tried to picture Lisa pregnant. Tried to imagine her moving through those months alone. If she had been alone. The thought created an uncomfortable pressure in his chest that he couldn't quite identify. Not guilt, exactly. Not regret. Something closer to vertigo. "I was thinking we should host something next month," his wife said, finally setting her phone down. "Maybe a dinner party. Something intimate. 8 people at most." "Sure," Charles replied automatically. She began listing potential guests, discussing menu options, weighing the social value of various combinations. Charles heard himself responding at appropriate intervals, his voice carrying the same measured tone it always did. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. A calculation he couldn't complete. A question he couldn't ask. They pulled into their driveway, a pristine colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping and warm light spilling from the windows. Home. Exactly the kind of home someone like Charles Johnson was supposed to have. His wife gathered her things, still talking about the hypothetical dinner party, already planning the details with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Charles turned off the engine but didn't move immediately. For just a moment, he allowed himself to sit in the silence, his hands still resting on the steering wheel, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. Somewhere across the city, Lisa James was probably settling 3 babies down for the evening. Reading to them, maybe. Singing. Doing all the ordinary, exhausting things parents did. Without him. If they were his. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then opened the car door and stepped out into the cool evening air. His wife was already at the front door, keys in hand, waiting. Charles followed her inside, carrying a question he had no right to ask and no way to answer. The life he had built continued, smooth and predictable. But now it felt like something performed rather than lived. And that difference, small as it seemed, changed everything. Chapter 3. The Investigation. Charles didn't sleep well. He lay beside his wife in their king-sized bed, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, watching shadows shift across the ceiling as cars passed outside. The house settled around them with its usual nocturnal sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft click of the thermostat, the distant creaking of wood contracting in the cooling air. All of it felt wrong. At 3 a.m, he gave up pretending and went downstairs to his office. The room was dark except for the glow of his computer screen. Charles sat in the leather chair that had cost more than most people's monthly salary and stared at the search bar, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Lisa James. He typed her name, then hesitated. What was he looking for, exactly? Proof? Reassurance? Permission to stop thinking about her? The search results appeared, professional profiles, a few outdated social media accounts she'd apparently abandoned years ago. Nothing recent. Nothing revealing. Charles leaned back, rubbing his temples. This was ridiculous. He was a grown man, a successful businessman, sitting in the dark like some obsessed teenager, searching for traces of a woman he'd deliberately removed from his life. And yet he couldn't stop. The next morning, he called his assistant from the car. "I need you to pull some information for me," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Discreetly. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. What kind of information?" Charles paused at a stoplight, watching pedestrians cross. None of them were her. "Someone I used to know. Lisa James. I need to know where she's living now, what she's doing. Employment records if you can find them. But keep it quiet." His assistant didn't ask questions. That was why Charles paid her well. "I'll have something for you by end of day." The report arrived at 6:15, delivered to his personal email in a neat PDF attachment. Charles waited until he was alone in his office, door closed, before opening it. Current address, 2847 Maple Street, apartment 12B. The address meant nothing to him. A neighborhood across town, modest but respectable. Not the kind of place Charles would ever have reason to visit. Employment, part-time remote work, consulting. Previous employer, Marcus and Associates. She'd left her job, or scaled back significantly. The implications settled over Charles like cold water. Family status, single. 3 children, born March 17th of last year. Charles stared at that line until the words blurred. March 17th. He opened his calendar app, scrolling backward through the months with mechanical precision. Their relationship had ended in May, 15 months ago. Before that, they'd been together for nearly 8 months. The mathematics were simple, brutal in their clarity. If the children had been born in March of last year, they would have been conceived in June or July of the previous year, when he and Lisa were still together. Charles closed the laptop slowly, his hands perfectly steady despite the chaos reorganizing itself inside his chest. She hadn't told him. She had been pregnant, with triplets, and she hadn't said a word. The anger came first, sharp and clarifying. Then confusion. Then something he didn't want to name. He thought back to their final conversation. The way she'd looked at him when he explained that he wasn't ready for the kind of future she wanted. The way she'd simply nodded, gathered her things, and left without argument or tears. She must have known then. She had walked away carrying 3 lives he'd had no idea existed, and she had never once reached out. Never demanded anything, never asked for help or explanations or support. Charles stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city lights spreading in every direction. Somewhere out there, Lisa was putting 3 children to bed. His children. And she had chosen to do it alone rather than tell him. The question that formed in Charles's mind wasn't whether he had a right to know. It was whether he had already lost the right to ask. Chapter 4, The Drive Across Town. Charles told his wife he had a late meeting. The lie came out smoothly, practiced from years of business dinners and client emergencies that required his immediate attention. She barely looked up from her tablet, already absorbed in planning the dinner party she'd mentioned days ago. "Don't forget we have the Hendersons thing on Saturday," she said. "I won't forget." He left before she could ask anything else. The drive across town took longer than expected. Evening traffic crawled through intersections, brake lights glowing red in the dimming light. Charles had the address memorized now, 2847 Maple Street, apartment 12B, though he hadn't consciously decided what he would do once he arrived. He just needed to see. The neighborhood was older than his own, with tree-lined streets and modest apartment buildings that had probably been built in the 70s. Not run down, but worn in a way that suggested people actually lived here rather than just invested in real estate. Charles found parking half a block away and turned off the engine. For several minutes, he simply sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his breath fogging slightly in the cooling air. "What are you doing?" The question should have stopped him. Should have been enough to make him start the car and drive home to the life he'd carefully constructed. The life that made sense, that followed rules, that didn't include surprised children and uncomfortable questions. Instead, he got out. The building was exactly as unremarkable as he'd expected. Brown brick, narrow hallways, a directory by the front entrance that listed residents by apartment number only. No names. 12B was on the second floor. Charles climbed the stairs slowly, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Each step felt like a decision he was making and unmaking simultaneously, momentum carrying him forward even as logic screamed at him to turn around. He reached the second floor and paused. Down the hallway, he could hear muffled sounds, television laugh tracks, someone's music playing too loud, the ordinary noise of people living their ordinary lives. Apartment 12B was halfway down on the left. Charles walked toward it, his heart beating harder than it had any right to. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just what? Checking? Confirming? Stalking the mother of children who might be his? He stopped outside the door. From inside, he heard voices. A woman's voice, Lisa's voice, singing something soft and repetitive. Then quieter sounds he couldn't quite identify. Movement. The creak of floorboards. Charles raised his hand to knock. His knuckles hovered inches from the wood. And then what? The question finally stopped him. What would he say? I saw you at a crosswalk and hired someone to find your address? I did the math and I think those children might be mine. Why didn't you tell me? Every possible opening sounded worse than the last. Behind the door, Lisa's voice continued, gentle and patient. She was singing a lullaby, he realized. Something about stars and moonlight. The kind of song parents sang when they were too tired to remember all the words, but too loving to stop trying. Charles lowered his hand. He stood there for another moment, listening to a life happening on the other side of a door he had no permission to open. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the cool evening air. He sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine. The question remained, unanswered and unanswerable. Not were they his. But what right did he have to disrupt the life Lisa had built without him? Charles drove home through streets that felt unfamiliar, even though he knew exactly where he was going. His wife was already asleep when he arrived. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, looking at her peaceful form, and felt like a stranger in his own life. Everything was exactly as it should be, and nothing felt right anymore. Chapter 5: The Unraveling. Charles couldn't stay away. Over the next 2 weeks, he found himself driving past Lisa's building with alarming frequency. Always with an excuse, a meeting that happened to be in the area, a restaurant recommendation he wanted to check out, a route that just happened to be more convenient. The lies piled up, small and manageable at first, then increasingly elaborate. He learned Lisa's routines without meaning to. She left the apartment around 9 most mornings, the triple stroller navigating the building's narrow entrance with practiced efficiency. Sometimes she walked to the small park 3 blocks away. Other times, she headed toward the grocery store, moving slowly, stopping frequently to adjust blankets or retrieve dropped toys. She always looked tired. Charles watched from his car, parked at careful distances, and cataloged details he had no right to know. The way she hummed while she walked. The efficiency with which she managed 3 babies simultaneously, bottle in one hand, pacifier in the other, somehow always knowing which child needed what. The absence of anyone helping her. She was doing this alone. The observation sat uncomfortably in Charles's chest, producing a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not guilt, exactly. Something sharper. At home, his wife had started noticing his distraction. You've been working late a lot, she mentioned one evening over dinner that neither of them was really eating. Big project, Charles said.
International client.
Time zone differences. She nodded, accepting the explanation because she always did. Their marriage ran on mutual non-interference, on the agreement that neither would demand too much of the other's attention or emotional energy. It had seemed like wisdom once. Now, it just felt hollow. The Hendersons are asking about our availability for their anniversary party next month, she continued, moving seamlessly to the next topic. I told them we'd likely attend, but I wanted to check with you first. Charles made a non-committal sound, his mind already elsewhere. That Saturday, he saw Lisa at the park. He hadn't planned it, or maybe he had, and just hadn't admitted it to himself. Either way, he found himself parking near the small playground she frequented, watching as she settled on a bench with the stroller positioned carefully in the shade. She looked different in natural light. Softer somehow. Or maybe just exhausted in a way that fluorescent grocery store lighting hadn't captured. One of the babies started crying, a sharp, insistent sound that carried across the park. Lisa reached into the stroller without hesitation, lifting a small bundle and bringing it against her shoulder, swaying gently as she murmured words Charles couldn't hear. The crying stopped. Another baby immediately started. Lisa sighed. Charles could see it in the set of her shoulders, and somehow managed to hold one child while repositioning another, her movements automatic from repetition. No one came to help her. No partner arrived with coffee or offered to take one of the babies. No family member appeared to give her a break. Just Lisa, alone on a park bench, managing 3 infants with the grim determination of someone who had no other choice. Charles gripped his steering wheel, his knuckles white. This was his fault. Not the babies themselves. He still didn't know for certain they were his, though the timeline left little room for doubt. But this. Her isolation. The way she carried the entire weight alone. She had tried to talk to him about the future, about plans and possibilities and what came next. And he had shut her down, explained calmly that he wasn't interested in complications, that he preferred simplicity. So she had given him exactly what he wanted. Simplicity. A life with no unexpected demands, no inconvenient truths, no messy emotional entanglements. She had taken the complication and disappeared with it. Charles started his car before he could do something stupid like approach her. But as he drove away, watching her shrink in his rearview mirror, one truth became impossible to ignore. He had gotten exactly what he asked for. And it was destroying him. Chapter 6, The Encounter. Charles didn't plan to speak to her. He told himself he was just driving through the neighborhood again, a route that happened to pass the small coffee shop Lisa sometimes visited on weekday mornings. He would see her from a distance, confirm she was managing, and continue with his day. That was the plan. But when he pulled up to the intersection, Lisa was standing on the corner, struggling with the stroller. One of the wheels had caught on the curb, and she was trying to lift the entire apparatus while simultaneously preventing one of the babies from dropping a bottle onto the sidewalk. Charles watched for 3 seconds. Then, he was out of the car. "Let me help." Lisa's head snapped up, her eyes widening in recognition. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city continued around them, cars honking, pedestrians flowing past, but in that small space between them, time seemed to stop. Charles. His name came out flat, carefully neutral. "The wheel stuck," he said, gesturing unnecessarily. I've got it." But she didn't. The stroller remained wedged, and one of the babies had started crying, a sound that seemed to trigger the other 2 in rapid succession. Lisa closed her eyes briefly, her jaw tightening with the particular frustration of someone operating on too little sleep and too much responsibility. Charles stepped forward and lifted the front of the stroller, freeing the wheel in one smooth motion. "Thank you," Lisa said quietly, still not quite looking at him. She should have walked away then. Should have taken her children and disappeared back into the life she'd built without him. Instead, she stood there, one hand gripping the stroller handle, the other reaching automatically to adjust a blanket. Up close, Charles could see details he'd missed from the car. The shadows under her eyes. The coffee stain on her sleeve. The way her hands moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing tasks they'd done 1,000 times. "They're beautiful," Charles said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Lisa's expression didn't change. "Thank you." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither was saying. "How old are they?" Charles asked, even though he already knew. Even though he'd memorized the date from the report his assistant had provided. 9 months. Lisa's voice remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes. A calculation. A decision being made. 9 months old. Born in March. Conceived in June. The mathematics hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. "Lisa." "Don't." The word came out sharp, surprising them both. Lisa took a breath, softening slightly. "Please, don't." One of the babies, a little girl with dark hair, reached up from the stroller, her tiny hand grasping at air. Lisa automatically adjusted her position, giving the child something to hold on to. Charles stared at that small hand, those impossibly tiny fingers, and felt something crack inside his chest. I didn't know, Lisa said quietly, answering the question he hadn't asked. Not until after. You could have told me, could I? Lisa finally looked directly at him, and the expression in her eyes was more complicated than anger. You told me you weren't interested in complications, that you wanted simplicity, a clean life. She gestured to the stroller, to the 3 babies requiring simultaneous attention. This is the opposite of simple, Charles. That's not. You made your choice very clear. Lisa's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. So I made mine. I chose not to trap you in a life you explicitly didn't want. They're mine. Charles said it as a statement, not a question. Lisa didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the children, her children, and something in her expression softened. They're mine, she finally said. I've been doing this alone since the beginning. They don't need a father who shows up out of obligation. That's not fair. Fair. Lisa laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to talk about fair? The baby who'd been crying escalated, and Lisa immediately shifted her attention, lifting the child with practiced ease. The conversation was over. I have to go, she said. Charles watched her navigate the stroller down the sidewalk, managing 3 lives with the quiet confidence of someone who'd had no choice but to figure it out. He stood on the corner long after she disappeared from view.
Fair.
Nothing about this was fair. Chapter 7, The Confession. Charles came home to find his wife in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand, and an expression he'd never seen before on her face. We need to talk, she said. The words landed with unexpected weight. In their entire marriage, she had never initiated a serious conversation. They existed in a carefully maintained equilibrium where neither pushed too hard, neither demanded too much. Charles set down his briefcase. About what? About wherever you've been going. She took a measured sip of wine. And don't say work. I called your office twice this week. You weren't there. The lie he'd been constructing died before he could speak it. Something in her tone told him she wouldn't accept it anyway. Charles sat down across from her, the space between them feeling wider than the few feet it actually was. There's someone I used to know, he began carefully. Before we were married. She has children. I think. He stopped, recalibrated. They might be mine. His wife didn't react immediately. She sat perfectly still, her wine glass suspended halfway to her lips, her face a mask of careful composure. I see, she finally said. I didn't know. She never told me. I only found out recently by accident. How recently? 2 weeks ago. His wife nodded slowly, processing. And you've been what? Following her? Investigating? Trying to understand? Trying to decide? The correction hit harder than Charles expected. Because she was right. That's exactly what he'd been doing. Trying to decide whether this mattered. Whether it changed anything. Whether he could simply file it away as an unfortunate complication and continue with the life he'd chosen. What's her name? His wife asked.
Lisa.
Do you still love her? The question surprised him. In all their years together, they had never talked about love. Not in any meaningful way. Their relationship was built on compatibility, on shared social circles and complementary life goals. Love had always seemed beside the point. I don't know, Charles said honestly. His wife set down her wine glass with deliberate care. I think you do know. You just don't want to admit it. That's not fair. Charles. She said his name with unusual gentleness. We've been married for 3 years. In that entire time, I've never seen you distracted. Never seen you unsettled. You're the most controlled person I know. She paused. Until 2 weeks ago. Charles had no response to that. We have a good life together, she continued. It's exactly what we both said we wanted. Stable. Predictable. No drama. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. But I don't think that's what you want anymore. I haven't decided anything. Yes, you have. His wife stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that were perfectly steady. You decided the moment you started lying to me. The moment you chose to drive across town to watch a woman you claim not to love. The moment you found out you might be a father and couldn't walk away. She picked up her wine glass and walked toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom. I'm not angry, she said, and Charles believed her. We both knew what this marriage was, what it wasn't. She met his eyes with unexpected clarity. But I deserve someone who's actually present. And those children, if they're yours, deserve a father who wants to be there. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to decide what kind of person you want to be. The man who chose safety and simplicity, or the man who's willing to choose something messier and more real.
She started up the stairs, then stopped.
I'll be staying at my sister's for a few days. That should give you time to figure it out. Charles listened to her footsteps receding down the hallway, heard the quiet sounds of her packing a bag. He sat alone in the living room of the house he'd bought because it projected the right image, married to a woman he'd chosen because she asked for nothing he wasn't willing to give. And for the first time, he understood what he'd actually been running from all these years. Not complications, not mess, but the terrifying vulnerability of actually mattering to someone, of being needed in ways that couldn't be scheduled or controlled, of loving something so much that losing it would break him. He'd thought he was choosing safety. He'd actually been choosing emptiness. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn, the pristine driveway, the perfect facade of a life that suddenly felt like a museum exhibit. Somewhere across town, 3 children were learning to exist in a world that hadn't asked for their permission. And he was their father. The decision, he realized, had already been made. Now he just had to find the courage to follow through. Chapter 8. The Lawyer. Charles sat across from Marcus Chun in an office that smelled of leather and expensive coffee. I need to understand my options, Charles said, his hands folded carefully on the polished desk between them. Marcus, one of the best family lawyers in the city, leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral in the way only lawyers could manage. Let's start with what you know for certain. 3 children. Born in March of last year. The mother and I were in a relationship at the time of conception. She never informed me of the pregnancy or the births. And you've confirmed paternity? Not officially. But the timeline is, Charles paused. Conclusive. Marcus made a note on the legal pad in front of him. Have you spoken to the mother about your intentions? Briefly. She made it clear she's been managing alone and doesn't need my involvement. But you want to be involved. It wasn't a question, but Charles answered anyway. Yes.
Why?
The directness of it caught Charles off guard. They're my children. That's biology, Marcus said. I'm asking about motivation. Because the court will ask the same question, and they share my DNA, isn't compelling when you've been absent for 9 months. Charles felt the words land like physical blows. I didn't know they existed. Which is relevant context, but not a complete defense. Marcus set down his pen. Family court prioritizes the best interests of the child. Right now, those children have stability, one consistent parent, an established routine, no disruption. You're the disruption, Charles. So, what are you saying? That I have no rights? I'm saying your rights exist, but they're not automatic. Especially not for someone who wasn't present at birth, didn't contribute financially, and has no established relationship with the children. Marcus softened slightly. If you want custody or even regular visitation, you'll need to prove paternity first. That requires the mother's cooperation or a court order. And if she refuses? Then we petition the court. File for paternity testing. It gets adversarial quickly. Marcus leaned forward. Is that really what you want? To force the mother of your children into a legal battle? Charles thought of Lisa on that park bench, managing 3 babies alone. Thought of the exhaustion in her eyes, the careful way she'd built a life that didn't include him. No, he said quietly. Then you need to talk to her. Not as someone asserting rights, but as someone asking for the opportunity to be a father. Marcus pulled out a business card and slid it across the desk. This is a mediator I work with. She specializes in cases like yours, unmarried parents trying to establish arrangements without destroying each other in the process. Charles took the card, staring at the name printed in elegant script. "One more thing," Marcus said. "If you do this, if you commit to being in these children's lives, you need to be all in." Family court doesn't look kindly on fathers who show up, disrupt established routines, then disappear when things get difficult. These aren't business negotiations you can walk away from. "I understand. Do you?" Marcus's expression turned serious. "Because from what you've told me, your entire life has been built on maintaining control and avoiding complications. 3 9-month-old triplets are the definition of chaos. Late nights, constant demands, zero flexibility. Your schedule won't be yours anymore. Your priorities will shift. Everything changes. I know that. Knowing it intellectually and living it are very different things." Marcus stood, signaling the end of the consultation. "Talk to the mother first. See if you can find common ground. If she's willing to work with you, this can be handled privately, cooperatively. If not," he gestured to the stack of legal files on his desk, "it gets ugly fast." Charles left the office with a mediator's card in his pocket and a clarity he hadn't possessed when he arrived. He didn't want a legal battle. He didn't want to force his way into Lisa's life or disrupt what she'd built. He wanted permission.
Permission to try. To fail.
To learn how to be someone he'd never been before. But permission wasn't something he could demand or negotiate. It had to be given. And Lisa had every reason to refuse. Charles sat in his car in the parking garage, his phone in his hand, Lisa's number on the screen, found through the same investigator who'd provided her address. He could call, leave a message, ask to meet, or he could respect the boundaries she'd set and walk away. His finger hovered over the call button. The choice was simple. The courage to make it was not. Chapter 9, The Letter. Charles didn't call. Instead, he spent 3 days writing a letter he rewrote 17 times. Each version felt wrong in different ways. Too formal. Too emotional. Too apologetic. Not apologetic enough. Words that demanded when they should have requested, or begged when they should have simply stated the truth. On the 4th day, he stopped trying to find the perfect words and just wrote what he felt. Lisa, I don't have the right to ask anything of you. I know that. You built a life without me because I made it clear I didn't want the complications that came with real connection. You took me at my word, and I can't fault you for that. But I saw you at that crosswalk 3 weeks ago, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about those 3 children. About the timeline. About the conversation we never had. I'm not writing to demand answers or assert rights I probably don't deserve. I'm writing because I need you to know that if those children are mine, I want to be their father. Not out of obligation. Not because a lawyer told me I should. But because I've spent the last 3 weeks realizing that the life I built, the one I was so proud of, the one that seemed so rational and controlled, is completely empty. You were right about me.
It chose simplicity over substance.
I chose predictability over connection. I chose safety over everything that actually matters. I can't undo that. I can't give you back the 9 months you spent alone, or the sleepless nights, or any of the moments I should have been there for. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to be present for the moments ahead. I'm not asking for custody or formal arrangements. I'm just asking for a chance.
To meet them.
To learn how to be what they need. To prove that I'm capable of being more than the person who walked away. If the answer is no, I'll respect that. You've earned the right to make that decision without pressure from me. But if there's any possibility, any chance at all, I'm asking you to consider it.
Charles.
He read it one final time, then sealed it in an envelope before he could change his mind. Delivering it was harder. Charles stood outside Lisa's apartment building for 10 minutes, the envelope in his hand, doubts circling like a predator. What if she read it and laughed? What if she threw it away unopened? What if his words only made things worse? He climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallway was quiet this time, early afternoon, most residents at work. Charles approached 12B and stood outside the door, listening for sounds of life inside. Nothing.
She was probably out.
At the park, maybe, or running errands with 3 babies in tow, navigating a world that wasn't built for single mothers managing triplets alone. Charles crouched and slid the envelope under the door, watching it disappear into the apartment. Then he stood, pressed his palm briefly against the wood, a gesture that felt both foolish and necessary, and walked away. The waiting was excruciating. Charles checked his phone obsessively, even though Lisa had no reason to respond quickly. Or at all. At home, though it didn't feel like home anymore, he moved through rooms that suddenly felt too large, too empty. His wife's absence had created a silence that pressed against him like physical weight. She'd texted once, "I've contacted a lawyer. We can handle this civilly." Charles had expected relief. Instead, he felt nothing. The end of his marriage should have devastated him, or at least registered as significant loss. It didn't, because it had never been real, not in the way that mattered. On the third day after delivering the letter, his phone rang. Unknown number. Charles stared at the screen, his heart rate accelerating in a way that felt both foolish and inevitable. He answered. "It's Lisa." 2 words. Neutral tone. Giving nothing away. "Thank you for calling," Charles said, immediately hating how formal he sounded. "I got your letter." Silence stretched between them. Charles waited, not trusting himself to speak. "I need to think about this," Lisa finally said. "It's not just about you and me anymore. It's about them. About what's best for them." "I understand. Do you?" There was no hostility in the question, just genuine uncertainty. Because once you're in their lives, Charles, you can't decide it's too hard and leave. They can't lose a parent they've learned to count on. "I won't leave." "You don't know that. You can't possibly know that." She was right. He couldn't promise something he'd never done before, couldn't guarantee he wouldn't fail in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "You're right," Charles said. "I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise I'll try. Every day. For as long as they need me." Lisa was quiet for a long time. "I'll call you back," she finally said. The line went dead. Charles sat in the silence, the phone still pressed to his ear, and waited for a future he had no right to expect but couldn't stop hoping for. Epilogue 6 months later. Charles arrived at Lisa's apartment at exactly 9 a.m., the way he did every Saturday. He'd learned to be punctual in new ways now, not the corporate punctuality of calculated impressions, but the practical kind that mattered when someone was counting on you to show up so they could take their first uninterrupted shower in 3 days. Lisa opened the door before he could knock, already handing him a diaper bag. "Sophia needs to be changed." Mason threw up on his shirt. "There's a clean one in the side pocket." "Emma's been fussy all morning, so good luck." She paused, really looking at him for the first time. "You look tired." "Late night reviewing the custody agreement with my lawyer." "Our custody agreement," Lisa corrected gently. "We're doing this together, remember?" 6 months ago, that word, together, would have terrified him. Now it just felt right. The arrangement had started small. Supervised visits, an hour at a time, with Lisa always present. Charles had been terrible at first, fumbling with diapers, holding bottles at wrong angles, panicking when one baby cried, and not knowing which one needed what. Lisa had watched him struggle without intervening, letting him figure it out the way she'd had to. Gradually the visits extended. 2 hours. 4 hours. Then full mornings, then overnights, though those still made Charles nervous in ways business negotiations never had. The paternity test had been a formality. Charles had known the truth the moment he'd held Sophia for the first time and seen his own eyes staring back at him. 3 children. His children. The reality of it still took his breath away sometimes. "How are you doing?" Lisa asked, genuine concern in her voice. They developed something unexpected over these months, not the relationship they'd had before, but something more honest. A partnership built on shared responsibility rather than romance, on mutual respect rather than attraction. Charles's divorce had been finalized last month. Amicable, expensive, and strangely painless. His ex-wife had moved to Boston with her new partner, someone she'd apparently been seeing casually and who wanted the same things she did. She'd been right. They both deserved more than what they'd settled for. "I'm good," Charles said, and meant it. From inside the apartment, a baby started crying. Then another. Then all 3, in the cascading chaos Charles had learned was just normal Saturday morning. "Your turn," Lisa said with a smile that held more warmth than he probably deserved. Charles stepped inside, setting down his coffee and picking up Sophia with the practiced ease of someone who'd made every possible mistake and survived them all. Emma grabbed his finger. Mason looked up at him with serious eyes. Sophia drooled on his shirt, an expensive shirt he no longer cared about ruining. This wasn't the life Charles had planned. It wasn't controlled or predictable or simple. It was messy and exhausting and frequently overwhelming. It was real. And for the first time in his adult life, Charles Johnson felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Hey," Lisa said from the doorway, her jacket already on. "Thank you for showing up, for trying." "Thank you for letting me," Charles replied. She nodded and headed out, leaving him alone with 3 9-month-olds who had no idea how completely they'd rearranged his understanding of everything that mattered. Charles looked down at the 3 small faces depending on him and smiled.
He was a father.
Imperfect, still learning, frequently uncertain, but present. And that he'd finally learned was what actually counted. Thank you for listening to Megan Romance Audiobooks. If you enjoyed this story about second chances, unexpected fatherhood, and the courage to choose messy reality over perfect illusion, please subscribe to our channel for more emotional romance stories that explore the complicated beauty of love and family. And comment below with the country you're listening from. We love knowing where our stories are reaching around the world. Until next time, remember, sometimes the life you didn't plan becomes the one you needed all along.